In the first section of this lecture, I talked about how even if we go back to the 18th and 19th century, we see Africa and Asia falling behind other regions in the world which were developing. In this section of the lecture, I want to talk about some of the factors which predisposed or caused Africa to be a poor economy in that period. One of those factors is productivity in agriculture, and there's a variety of problems of geography for agricultural development in tropical countries. And we saw in the first section of the lecture how a very large part of Africa falls between that tropical zone, between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. And so tropical countries, we know, tend to have poor soil quality, so the frequent rainfall leaching the soil of nutrients. We know they tend to have a high incidence of crop pests and parasites which destroy crops and which make it difficult to raise livestock. There's a high evaporation rate of water, and also a tendency for there to be unstable supply of water. Lack of appropriate climate for growing temperate grain crops, so the type of crops which had been grown, for example, in Europe and in the settler economies, the climate in Africa isn't correct for growing those type of crops. And as well, there's the disease environment, which involves the scope for transmission of infectious diseases such as malaria. So a variety of geographic and health-related factors which predisposed, because of its location in the tropics, Africa to be a low productivity agricultural producer in the period of the, for example, 1700s. Another factor is also Africa having relatively low population density and high transport costs deterring industrialisation. So, for example, this is moving forward a little bit in time, but in 1900 we know that the population density in Africa was about 4.4 people per square kilometre, whereas in China it was about 45, and in Europe it was 65. And that population density would be, that relativity would be quite similar going back to previous periods. And so that low population density, high transport costs really acted as a barrier to industrialisation. And you remember that when we've talked about growth of productivity in agriculture, for example, in Europe during the Industrial Revolution, one of the ideas is that industrialisation actually promotes productivity growth in agriculture, that the need to be able to feed extra population, the rising wages that come through industrialisation force an increase in productivity in agriculture. And so not only has there been geographic factors predisposing there to be low productivity in agriculture in Africa, nor has there been the impetus to improving agricultural productivity from industrialisation as happened in some other parts of the world. Another perspective on agricultural development in Africa comes from the work of Jared Diamond in his important and influential book Guns, Germs and Steel. In that book, Diamond is trying to answer the question of why is it that Europe colonised the rest of the world rather than the other way around. And he argues that the explanations are to do with geography and agricultural development and productivity. And in particular, he gives three explanations. One is, he says that regions of the world that are best endowed with wild plants and animals suitable for domestication are able to most quickly develop farm-based agriculture systems rather than, for example, nomadic systems or smaller scale agricultural systems. So where plants or animals could be domesticated, then you could develop larger scale farming activity. He also argues that being located on a continent with east-west orientation was important. That's because if you're on an east-west orientation, then it means you've got similar latitude, similar climate across the continent, so that innovations in agriculture to improve productivity at one point can be spread to a different point of the continent. Whereas, by comparison, if you're on a north-south continent, because there's different latitudes, different continents, it's much less likely that, say, an innovation from the north can be taken to the south to increase agricultural productivity there because of different climate and geographic conditions. So Diamond is saying, look, Europe was advantaged because it had plants and animals that could be domesticated, and whenever there was an innovation in agricultural productivity, it could spread across the continent. So Diamond argues that Europe, therefore, was really the first to develop farm-based agriculture, and it was farm-based agriculture producing food on a larger scale that he said was an important contribution to industrialisation, because industrialisation was going to involve taking some of the workforce from agriculture to industry, but also having urbanisation. And so you really needed this more settled farm-based system of agriculture to be able to feed the urban industrial workforce. Diamond also argues that there's a third factor, which is that once you got the large-scale farm-based agriculture and urbanisation of industrial activity, then because of the proximity of humans to farm animals, you got diseases such as smallpox and measles being caught by the population, and the population starting to develop resistance to those germs. So the Europeans were the earliest to industrialise, and they developed resistance to disease, Diamond argues, because they were the earliest economies at becoming high productivity agricultural economies. Where does Africa fit into that? Well, the big point about Africa, as you can see here, is being the north-south continent. So by being a north-south continent, Africa lacks the second condition which Diamond describes Europe as having and as being important for its earlier agricultural and hence industrial development. Africa also ranks below Europe in terms of the domesticable plants and animals which can be spread across the continent. So Diamond is giving or fitting the African experience in a way within a broader global perspective. That at the start of this section I talked about some reasons why Africa might have been a low productivity agricultural producer, and Diamond's then fitting that into a larger story about economic development. A second aspect of Africa, which is generally regarded by economic historians as being important in explaining the low level of economic development in the period, for example, we're talking about 17th century and onwards, is delayed institutional development. So generally we think of a central state as being needed to provide public goods, and we think of those public goods as being an essential input to economic development. Central states, by and large, don't start developing in Africa till around the 17th century, which is several hundred years after central states are developing in other parts of the world, such as Europe. So Africa has this delay in the creation of central states, and we think of central states as being important in economic development. Subsequently, delayed institutional development can be argued to continue to be important as a driver of economic development in Africa, is that a second aspect of institutional development that's then thought of as being important for economic development is the transition from an absolutist state to a political system where the government or the elite are more accountable to the main groups in society. And whereas we observe that happening, for example, in England after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and we observe it happening in other parts of Europe progressively in the 18th and 19th century, that hasn't happened, certainly not to the same degree in Africa. So Africa has had a delayed institutional development, which has really meant that it's been delayed in being able to create the type of infrastructure, the type of policy settings which have been necessary for economic development. This next graph is an index of political centralisation in different parts of the world, an index that's an average from the year 1 through to 1950, where one would be regarded as having the highest degree of centralisation across that whole period. 0 would be regarded as having no centralisation in terms of this index across the whole of the period. Here, centralisation is being measured essentially in terms of the levels of hierarchy in the political system in a country. And you can see that whereas Europe, Asia, Middle East and North Africa rank as being relatively highly centralised across the whole of this period, Africa is one of the groups of regions that ranks as being having relatively low levels of centralisation. For some of these other areas like North America and Oceania, because this is an average from 1 to 1950, it's a little bit difficult to compare directly, because for a lot of these, for the current period where we think of those regions as being relatively highly developed, that's a relatively brief period of that whole period. During that period they have had centralised states, but that's a relatively brief period. When we look at the African part, we're looking at an area where pretty consistently across the whole of the period there's been a relatively low level of political centralisation. Why has there been this weak development of central states? Well, there's different explanations. One is the idea that because Africa is land abundant, it's been difficult for a dominant group in society to try to develop into a state through collecting revenue from other members of society through taxation. So often in societies where central states are emerging, there'll be taxation of land as a basis for generating revenue to underpin the existence of the apparatus of the central state. But as a land abundant country where land could be, new land could be taken up relatively cheaply by the population, there wasn't that basis for taxing land that there was in some other areas, that there weren't the same rents to land that could be taxed. There's a variety of influences that are often called the Eurasian influences, where some question the validity of applying those to Africa, but where other economic historians have given these explanations quite a bit of prominence. So if we think about the development of central states in Europe and Asia, we tend to think of features of those societies like high population density, incidence of warfare, high level of trade as promoting the development of central states. And so some have argued that the low population density in Africa, the low incidence of trade are factors that have been associated with the failure to develop central states. And also a third explanation is an idea that the distribution of power in traditional African societies has been such that it's acted as a barrier to the development of dominance by one group in society. So here the argument is that historically the development of central states has usually been associated with the rise to dominance of one group, but that the distribution of power in Africa traditionally has been such that it's acted as a barrier to that happening. So there's a variety of different explanations for why there's been this weak development of central states in Africa, but a universal acceptance that this has been a fact of African experience. What's been the effect of a lack of central states? Well, there's a variety of studies that have looked at the correlates of provision of public goods and public infrastructure with the degree of development of central states in Africa. And that evidence tends to suggest that where the development of central states has been weakest, that's where the provision of public goods has been weakest. And some evidence as well that that's deterred investment in private capital. So 2 arguments that I've talked about so far for why we might think of Africa as historically having a low level of development. One is the predisposition to being low productivity agricultural producer. Secondly, the absence of the development of central states as an underpinning factor to promotion of agricultural productivity or development of trade, development of industrialisation. The other aspect of this earliest phase of African economic development that I want to talk about is slavery. And in a previous lecture, we've talked about the Atlantic slave trade as part of the development of the European economy and the Columbian exchange during that period. And I want to elaborate on that a little bit in this section of the lecture. One point that I need to make is that there had been pre-existence of slavery for several hundred years at least in sub-Saharan Africa, and longer if we go back to the area of Middle Eastern Africa as well. So slavery wasn't a new phenomenon in Africa. Nevertheless, it was the case that the Atlantic slave trade represented a major increase in the incidence of slavery within sub-Saharan Africa. And you might remember that we talked about this Atlantic slave trade as being part of the triangular pattern of trade that came about as part of the development of European economies, where Africa was sending slaves to, for example, the Americas, where the labour was being used to grow sugar, raw cotton. Those raw materials were then being sent to Europe, where they were being processed into manufactured goods, which were being sent back to the New World markets, including Africa, for sale. The other manufactured goods sent back to Africa in very large volume was, of course, guns and firearms to underpin the slave trade that was occurring. And we've talked previously about that having direct effects on economic development during the period in which the slave trade was occurring. So, for example, there's the hugely disruptive effect of the warfare that was the basis of the taking of the slaves and the selling of them to be transported. There's also obviously a major demographic impact. By some estimates, the population of the regions where slaves were taken from being halved during the period when the slave trade was at its peak. The Atlantic slave trade was at its peak compared to what otherwise would have occurred. And obviously the section of the population that was being taken was the prime age section of the population, who would have been able to contribute most to economic activity in their home countries at that time. So a very large adverse direct effect on economic development of the slave trade. So reducing economic development from what it otherwise would have been in the absence of this Atlantic slave trade. As this quote from Acemoglu and Robinson suggests, after the abolition of the slave trade out of Africa, states had specific investments in slaving and slavery. Instead of selling the slaves to Europeans, many of them now were profitably put to work in Africa. So instead of slavery ending, the same domination of some groups in Africa over other groups remains, and the population who would have been enslaved and sent to the Americas, for example, are simply made to work under similar conditions in Africa. This is a graph which I've shown before, which shows the incidence of slavery and shows that at the peak of slavery in the 18th and early 19th century, there's about 3 to 4 million slaves being sent from Africa to the Americas, making the point that this was a huge transfer of population. And so even though slavery had existed before, this was a change in the extent of slavery. And so we do need to think about there being serious consequences from the change in the degree of slavery for the economic performance of Africa. As we've talked about before, and which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail now, there's also long-term effects of slavery. So there are the direct effects, adverse effects of slavery on African economic performance at the time it's occurring, but there are also these long-term effects of slavery. So this is through the work of Nathan Nunn, which we showed a graph of in an earlier lecture, that even if we look at GDP per capita today, we still see that countries that were high slave countries back in this period of the 18th century have lower GDP per capita than countries which were zero slave countries at that time. In fact, in 1970, that gap was a multiple of 2, but by 2010, the gap is a multiple of 5. So if you think about the African growth in GDP per capita in the period after 1950 that I talked about in the overview to this lecture, and the idea that there is some experience of African growth in the period, for example, the 1990s and 2000s, this fact is telling you that a lot of that growth that's occurring more recently is concentrated in the zero slave countries. Previously, when I presented this information, I just presented this data to make the point that, look, slavery casts a long shadow. But now I just wanted to make an extra point, which comes from a further study by Nathan Nunn, this one joint with Leonard Wanchicon, which tries to look at why it is that there's been this long-term effect on economic performance from slavery. And they emphasise the role of trust and social cohesion. And their conclusion is that we find that individuals belonging to ethnic groups that were most exposed to the slave trades exhibit lower levels of trust in their relatives, neighbours, co-ethnics and local government today. So they use a variety of social surveys to make the point that there's a correlation between the incidence of slavery back in the 18th, 17th, 18th centuries and levels of trust today. And then they also, to close the loop on that argument, present a variety of evidence to suggest that these were not differences in levels of trust that existed at the time or prior to slavery, the Atlantic slave trade. That this loss of trust is something that we can attribute to the existence of the slave trade. So in this section of the lecture, I've talked about several reasons for Africa being a country with low levels of economic development, the geographic factor, the historical lack of central states, and then the role of slavery, in particular in the period around the 17th, 18th and early 19th century. In the next section of the lecture, I'll move on to talk about the colonial phase of African economic development.